From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. I'm pleased to be joined here today by Professor Randall Woods, Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas. He's been there a number of decades and kind of a very prominent biographer of our past presidents and others included. But for the purpose of today's conversation, I want to highlight his newest book. It's a big one, but it's worth every page. John Quincy Adams, A Man for the Whole People. Professor Woods, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So we have a very clear question to get at the beginning of this conversation, and that's a man for the whole people. Why that subtitle? Did John Quincy Adams live up to that objective?
I think he did. It came from a passage in his diary in which he said, I would fain be a man for the whole people. That was his objective. And I think I can say that given the restraints of the time, the racism, the misogyny, the culture, that he succeeded to a remarkable extent. He championed the cause of Native Americans who were being forcibly removed. He had close ties to the free black community. He was, in his later career, the scourge of the slave power. And politically, he switched parties from the Federalist Party to the Republican Party and then later to the Whig Party, on the basis of which party he believed at the time was best promoting the national interest. He was a Hamiltonian. He was a nationalist. His favorite clause in the preamble to the Constitution was the object of the federal government is to promote the general welfare. So I think that the subtitle is a statement of his goal for himself, but personally, I believed he came close to fulfilling that.
I want you to comment a little bit on the art of biography. You talked about these diaries that you pulled the quote from, and John Quincy, I guess is what we'll call him, has left a remarkably comprehensive set of diaries that you worked with. But, what do you think the impact of biography is, and what do you think are the necessary inputs to writing a quality biography?
Well, I think that historians, particularly in the latter stages of their career, have a duty to write with a broad brush, to try to inform the public discourse. And educated lay people are drawn to biographies. I have a friend a physician who said, I'll read anything having to do with history and people. And so I'm attracted to it because it's an opportunity to examine the impact that an individual's upbringing, their psychological makeup, their regional culture, as well as circumstance have on national and international policy. And those things, I'm not an advocate so much of the great man thesis. Certainly, the decision makers and presidents are severely constrained by circumstance. But still, I think biography is a vehicle. It's also, for me, I consider myself a writer as much as an historian. And with biography, you get to talk about place. You get to describe You get to set scenes. You get to deal with the dynamics of family, and blend those with earth-shaking, world-changing events. So it's a now. I have an unusual technique. I'll spend 6 or 7 years doing research, and then a year organizing the material, and then I'll sit down and write. And I'll write the biography from beginning to end. There are no chapters. There's no breaks. I write it from beginning to end, and then break it up into chapters, so that it has hopefully the quality of a story, if you will.
You mentioned biography allows you to highlight place, to highlight the personal, to highlight upbringing. And you bring out this really well. And first in your first chapter, the Adams of Braintree, but then throughout the whole book about John Quincy has this almost sense of inherited service from his family.
Absolutely.
And I want you to comment, if you could, not just on the relationship between John Adams and John Quincy Adams, which clearly is very influential, but also his relationship with Abigail Adams, which clearly is also a very important one.
Well, it's crucial. Both of those relationships are crucial, and they're actually quite different. Quincy Adams was devoted to his father. His father was his teacher, his mentor, his exemplar. But they were also close emotionally. John Adams, when he went to Paris in 1778 to supervise the implementation of the Franco-American Treaty, took his 11-year-old son with him. And Quincy Adams remained at his side for the next 7 years. And they were boon companions. And so they had an intellectual connection, a philosophical connection, but an emotional connection as well. Quincy Adams would spend the middle part of his career, a large part of it, defending his father and his reputation. Quincy Adams' relationship with his mother was more complex. Abigail Adams was a woman of ambition. She wanted to play a role in the birth and evolution of her country, and the only way she could do that, given the laws of the time, women could not even own property. She had to do that through her children, and so she chose her eldest, John Quincy Adams, to be the vehicle of her ambition. While he was en route to Europe when he was 11, she wrote him a note that he later received, and it said to him, "My dear son, I would rather you sink to the bottom of the ocean than to commit a dishonorable act or to shame your country." She was unrelenting in her demand that he take every opportunity to advance himself, whether it was in the political corps, whether it was in the diplomatic corps or in politics. She ruined at least 2 of his romances, spoiled 2 of his early loves, because she believed it would interfere with his public career. And indeed, he did not inform his engagement to Louisa, his wife, until after the fact. Did not tell his mother. So there was a kind of brutality about their relationship that you didn't see with his father, and she was his. They both were his intellectual mates. They loved history, literature, when he was 10 years old, he recalled later in life that he heard his parents talk fondly about reading Paradise Lost, and so he snuck in and got a copy out of his mother's study, read it 3 times, and couldn't understand a word, and so he said he was so frustrated he started smoking. But he said it wasn't until 20 years later that he got it out and read it and began to understand it. But it shows you the kind of environment that he grew up in. The Adams were voracious intellectuals.
So John Quincy Adams, John Adams are obviously very close in Europe. 7-year kind of tour of Europe. Across all the really important capitals of the continent and in the court of St. James at the age of 11. That's an incredible moment in American history where the sense of nationhood is really forming. John Quincy Adams isn't in the United States, or what will become the United States. He's on the kind of wrong side of the Atlantic. How does that experience shape him?
Well, that's a very important point. He was as much a European as he was an American. He spent that time with his father. His father let him accompany him to meetings with prime ministers and chancellors, and they immersed themselves in European culture, went to the theater virtually every night, bought books, and both of them were accomplished conversationalists. So, yes, you're right. Adams, when he returned to the United States, was when he was 18 to attend Harvard, was much more of a European child than an American child. Although his ongoing correspondence with his mother and his other relatives who in America certainly kept him up to speed. But his familiarity with European politics and culture would serve him very well in his diplomatic career. And his judgment when he was ambassador to the Netherlands and to Prussia in the 90s, and then to Imperial Russia, then to Great Britain, and then when he was Secretary of State, his ability to predict the moves and to perceive the motives of Imperial Russia, Great Britain, France was almost unerring. And I think it was because of his dual citizenship, if you will, that he was able to be so effective.
Yeah, he's really one of the early republic's first great diplomats. And in truth, as you page through this biography, historians of American foreign relations are going to think this isn't a biography. This is a history of the early foreign relations of the United States. And it really, in many ways, the kind of foreign relation aspect is central to the plot of John Quincy Adams' character throughout your book. But I want to talk about how that creates a little difficulty for him as he kind of reacclimates into American society, as he becomes a man of Harvard. And, you point out there's some serious reservations that John Quincy Adams has about leaving Europe and returning to the United States. And many of his family seem to have some concerns about if he is American enough
That's right.
to re-enter public service. So what does that period in his life look like?
When he was in the United States, he was forced out of public office, out of the diplomatic corps after Thomas Jefferson became president. And so he came back to the United States and served in the Senate from Massachusetts, senator from Massachusetts, for 6 years before he returned to the diplomatic corps and was made America's first ambassador to Imperial Russia. When he was in the U.S., he longed for European culture. He missed the theater. He missed the art. He missed the conversation. He missed um, the scientific inquiry. America was culturally and politically in its infancy, as you well know. Um, and he didn't want America to emulate any of the monarchies of Europe. He wanted it to develop its own culture, its own identity. But there were things about nationhood, about great nations, and their achievements that were common, and that had to do with native literature, or native art, scientific inquiry into North American culture. So he was an outsider in a sense, but that he devoted that otherness in many ways. He utilized that otherness to help develop a unique American culture. So that's a very interesting point, I think.
One of those kind of components of a unique American culture is that sense of going west, right? Go west,
Absolutely.
young man.
Absolutely.
And you have this line in the book where you say something to the effect that John Quincy Adams is one of the chief dispensers of the spirit of manifest destiny.
Right.
That term manifest destiny is so fraught, and it has so many different kind of conceptions and competing interpretations. What is John Adams' sense of manifest destiny, and how does he try to will it into existence?
Well, I think it was for him more of a tool, a tool to seduce the American people into supporting continental expansion, and a blunt instrument to beat our opponents, particularly the British and the Spanish, over the head. The notion that a greater power had destined us to occupy all of North America. He was an orator who tied that to the Mayflower and the early Pilgrims' sense of being a city on the hill, an example to the rest of the world. He only half believed that. I mean, he was one of the great orators of his generation. He was particularly when it came to foreign affairs, and a very persuasive speaker. But he was a practitioner of realpolitik. I mean, the country was born 13 colonies, 3 million people perched on the edge of a huge continent, just waiting to be dominated by the British or the French or the Russians. And his obsession, particularly when he was Secretary of State, was to strengthen the country materially. In terms of immigration, in terms of acquisition of territory and the exploitation of natural resources, to make us strong enough to withstand any enemy, to ensure that we could operate independently in the international scene. So, I mean, he had a sense of destiny, but it was much more of a tool for him. He and his father were not Whiggish. They did not believe in the inevitability of democracy and progress and that sort of thing. They particularly John Adams took a far darker view of human nature than that. So. And Quincy Adams has been lambasted for being the father of American exceptionalism. But I think his goals were much more limited. He said, "We do not go forth in the world seeking monsters to slay." I remember that famous quote. So. His relationship with the concept of manifest destiny, I think, is a very complicated one, and to me, interesting.
I like how you've framed this kind of strategic and calculating mind of John Quincy Adams. That's not necessarily an insult, but you mentioned he's one of the great orators of his day, especially in the realm of foreign affairs, and yet he doesn't see himself as that when he's appointed to the Harvard position, the Harvard faculty for oratory. And the way you lay out his systematic approach to acquiring skills, tools, knowledge in order to achieve some clear objective is one very, very clear when he's appointed to the Harvard faculty and not yet really equipped to hold the position he's appointed to. But it's also very clear throughout his career. Is that something he inherits from John Adams? Is that something that he naturally comes to on his own?
Actually, in the early part of his career, when he was practicing law and in the state legislature, he lamented his inability to speak and to speak effectively and persuasively. So, as you pointed out, as with many things, he set about systematically correcting that. And he began to study the classics. His hero was Cicero, or if you do Latin, Cicero. And he typically turned a weakness into a strength, as you pointed out. Beginning in 1806, he was the Boylston professor of rhetoric at Harvard. He wrote a 2-volume history and study of rhetoric, and made himself into, by the time he reached the Senate, one of the great orators in American history.
Well, and this doesn't seem like any normal campaign book. This is serious scholarly stuff at the time.
Yeah, but then the question is, why was he such an awful politician? Why he was such a in terms, particularly after the arrival of the Jacksonian era and the coming of popular politics. He and his father loved to study the art of governance. They just didn't like to practice it, and they were, both John and John Quincy refused to kept political enemies within their own administration. They refused to campaign, backslap, kiss babies, trade favors. They both had. Both believed that they were above that. That had to do with their sort of their New England Federalist background, but also the kind of these people were not wealthy like Southern plantation owners, but they were intellectual elitists, and both of them believed that it was sufficient for a man to make his mark in public affairs, show his devotion to his country, and then have people rally to their side. That after that wasn't going to get it, as you well know, particularly beginning in the 1820s. So Quincy Adams's rhetorical abilities were brought best into effect when he was in Congress after he was president, when he, for 17 years, was the scourge of the slave power. And that his speeches and his essays were among the best, the most effective in all of American history.
I want to. You can read this book like a 3-act play, and you can read it. Europe in the early years, Act 1, the presidency, in national politics, Act Two, and the father of the house, dean of the house, years, kind of Act Three. That middle act. It's very rare for a president that time in his official career seems to be overshadowed by the rest of his career. I mean, John Quincy's time as president, even in your own kind of telling, occupies a relatively small piece of his biography.
Yes.
Both in terms of legacy and importance, but in terms of just how he sees the kind of course of his own life. But nonetheless, it's a very important presidency. And the elections he was involved in, as you noted, kind of we see a turn in how presidents come to power. So more color on that would be wonderful from you.
When he was elected in 1824, he was, in one sense, a minority president. Andrew Jackson got more popular votes, got more electoral votes, but not enough to capture the president. He was thrown in the House, and with each state having one vote. And Quincy Adams made a deal with Henry Clay. Clay was one of the contenders, but he didn't make it to the House through his support to Adams, and Adams was elected. Now, a footnote to that. The reason Andrew Jackson won the popular vote and the electoral vote was because of the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, which allowed Southern states to count slaves as 3/5 of a person in the allocation of votes. So, but Quincy Adams considered himself a minority president and made him tentative when he was in office. But he was not an unpopular president. He could have been more effective. His policies and his program very nationalist. The American plan was an active federal government that would pay for internal improvements, a strong military establishment, a protective tariff, very, very Hamiltonian. These things were all out of date. The Panic of 1819 had undermined support for the federal government. Debtors and business people who were ruined by the Panic of 1819 tended to blame the Bank of the United States and the federal government. As soon as Adams was elected, Jackson began campaigning against him, and Jackson and his supporters tapped into that popular discontent. And so Quincy Adams actually proposed a sweeping program of federal action, but his enemies controlled Congress, particularly the all-important House, and he got virtually none of his program passed. He was, in terms of policy making, not in diplomacy, but in terms of domestic policy making, his program was dead in the water from the very beginning. So he and his program came on the scene about 4 years too early. Had he been James Monroe, whose program he supported and identified, he would have gotten all the credit that Monroe has gotten for the policies he pursued. So I think that was. If in terms of it's a presidential biography in that I'm writing about a president. It's a biography of a president, but his presidency was not the high point of his career. But Anthony, there's something here that people ought to note, and Quincy Adams has not gotten his due, and that's a shame. Daniel Walker Howe, in his Pulitzer Prize winning book, What Hath God Wrought, dedicated that book to John Quincy Adams. Quincy Adams may have been defeated by Andrew Jackson in 1828, but he remained president of the United States. He remained a president of the United States until his death in 1848. in the public mind. He was the last link to the founding fathers. He because of his speaking ability, because of his opposition to slavery, he remained in the forefront of the public's consciousness until his death. I think probably the best known and most prominent American of his day in the years after his presidency.
It's clearly an interesting career. It doesn't follow this inevitable march of progress to the Oval Office. But one thing that's kind of missing in our conversation so far, you mentioned he's the last link to the founding fathers in the American public's estimation by the time of his death. When does John Quincy Adams step out of the shadow of John Adams?
Probably, well, there's two answers to that. That is, when did he step out of his emotional and intellectual shadow, and when did he step out of his public political shadow? I think that Quincy Adams had the long, interesting correspondence with his family when he was in Russia, and then at Ghent, and then in Great Britain. Long discussions about religion. The Adamses had rejected Calvinism. John was a Unitarian. John Quincy was a Congregationalist. They had long conversations about the Trinity and the role of religion in public life. And John Quincy began to, he was much more optimistic and positive than his father. He was much more of a builder than his father was, who was more of a preserver. Quincy Adams was, in a sense, more worldly than his father. Quincy Adams was his father's chief diplomatic advisor when Adams was vice president, and so he knew more about Europe than George Washington or John Adams or even Thomas Jefferson, even as a man in his 40s and 30s and 40s. You should remember now that John Adams you could argue that John Adams was relatively unknown until David McCullough got hold of him. So, I mean, really, well, that was much truer of the times. And John Adams was forgotten. He was regarded by Americans in the early part of the 19th century as a failure. The consensus was that he should never have been president, that he wasn't qualified to be president. He got some credit for ending the quasi-war with France, but Quincy Adams spent a great deal of his time in the early 19th century, in the early Republic, writing, trying to defend his father, trying to resurrect his reputation. But I wouldn't say that Quincy Adams was better known than his father during that period. It wasn't until the Transcontinental Treaty and the Monroe Doctrine that I think that Quincy Adams really emerged, if you will, from his father's shadow in the public's estimation.
So let's get to the final act of John Quincy Adams' life and career, and that's those 20 years or so in the House after the presidency.
Right.
When as you know, he becomes the scourge of the slave-owning class. How do you see his career kind of take shape? How does he draw on the experience he's had to be effective or to be impactful? Really, what is his effect on the trajectory of the United States?
Well, his family was appalled at his decision to go to the House. They thought it was undignified for a former president. And the House of Representatives, which was the seat of that's where all the great important issues were discussed and debated and settled. The House was a rough and tumble place. People brought guns and knives. There were duels. There were two saloons in the house, a special section for prostitutes in the galleries. People yelled, threw things. His family was afraid that he would be damaged, that his reputation would be damaged, and that he would be humiliated. Well, they quite underestimated John Quincy Adams in the House. He dominated it like a lion. And as I said, he was the scourge of the slave power. Quincy Adams came to feel some guilt. At the end of his career, he was conflicted about his legacy. He had been the architect of continental expansion and Transcontinental Treaty, the Oregon Treaty. But he also realized that in doing so, he facilitated the spread of slavery and strengthened it, and perhaps prolonged it. And so his unrelenting attacks on the slave power were driven by conviction and morality, but also guilt, I think. But I mean, he submitted constitutional amendment to abolish the 3/5 clause. He continually introduced legislation to provide for the compensated emancipation of slaves. He introduced hundreds of thousands of anti-slavery petitions, and even this champion of this man who was obsessed with strength in his country, and making it strong enough to survive in the world. At the end of his career, had reconciled himself to civil war and the inevitability of armed conflict, and even came to not endorse it. Although he did introduce a petition from New Englanders to secede from the Union in the 1840s, and in so doing so gave it his tacit support. Now there's some irony for you. But he was at the nexus of the shift in opinion in the northern and mid-Atlantic states, who were generally as racist as Southerners. The white population was as racist as Southerners, and who feared the sudden abolition of slavery. He used what he called the conspiracy by the slave power to add Texas to the Union. He used that to convince northern and mid-Atlantic working people that the slave power was bent on dominating them politically for the rest of their lives, for pursuing policies that would affect their social status, their economic well-being. And so by the end of his career, the northern and mid-Atlantic states hadn't embraced abolitionism, but they'd stopped holding anti-abolition societies. They'd stopped attacking and killing abolitionists, and you see this change, and it was this change that what would become the Republican Party, Party of Abraham Lincoln, would build on in later years. Maybe a final thing here, but I'm not a final thing about Adams. Just think about the breadth of his life. When he was 11, he went to the theater with his father and sat next to Voltaire. Abraham Lincoln was at his deathbed. Now, just think of the chronological and cultural expanse of that lifetime. I think it's really remarkable, if I do say so myself.
Certainly a fitting topic for a biography.
Yes, I think so.
Those two bookends. How many people had the chance to have conversations with both Lincoln and Voltaire? So at this point, I think it's a good chance to wrap our conversation. It's something we like to do here on Rendezvous with History is ask our guests to provide a little hint for history or hint for historians, and that is, from your perspective, what more needs to be done in the field of biography or the field of history for those aspiring historians out there, or what archives are worth looking at? Give us some hints.
Well, I don't know. I do political and diplomatic biography, but think of all the scientific figures, think of all the cultural figures who have been so important to American history. I think there's a lot of opportunity for historians to write about figures who, my topics are sort of conventional, but I think there are people in early environmentalists, for example, or even artists, people in the arts who had a dramatic impact on the country and on the country's evolving sense of who it is, its identity. I think I'm probably getting close to getting finished with my career, and maybe I have another book in me. But I tell my graduate students, my graduate students, my PhD students, come from Arkansas is a fine institution, but it's not Harvard or Yale or Princeton, and so they're going to have to write a dissertation that is publishable, or they're not going to get a job. They can't write about 14th century porcelain in Tibet, and nothing wrong with that. But that's not gonna get them on the market. They're going to have to write about things that that are discussed on NPR or in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Economist, or somehow linked. Their work's going to have a much larger impact. I had a student who did I do some Arkansas history. I did Bill Fulbright. Well, this student wrote on a man named Jim Johnson, who's a prominent, very effective segregationist. Well, what she found was that there's all kinds of layers in segregationist thought, just as there was an abolitionist thought. Or pro-slavery thought. I mean, there are these. What does segregationist mean? Well, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and she got into the whole concept of otherness, political expediency, otherness, racism, that sort of thing. So she takes this relatively minor figure in Arkansas politics, and she's got a great book out of that. So. It's you never know what you're going to find. But I encourage students to take a topic which has the potential to be expanded, to be connected with larger issues, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. Well, Professor Woods, thank you so much once again. Your new book, John Quincy Adams, A Man for the Whole People, available wherever you purchase your books. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate it.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.